I was 26 years old when my mother reached into the box I had shipped home from medical school, pulled out my freshly printed degree and told me it was a waste of paper. Not metaphorically. She held it over the kitchen trash can and dropped it in. Then she turned back to the stove like she had just thrown away a grocery receipt. I stood in that kitchen in complete silence, still wearing my coat from the drive home, and watched 4 years of 18-hour study sessions, 3 part-time jobs and $40,000 in student loans sit on top of a pile of coffee grounds and vegetable peelings. She didn't look back at me once. What my mother could not have known in that moment, what she had no possible way of calculating as she stirred whatever was on that stove, was that 15 years later she would be sitting in a specialist's waiting room in serious need of the exact field of medicine printed on that degree. And that the specialist's name on the door would be mine. Let me back up. My name is Vivian Stanhope. I grew up in Tunbridge Falls, a mid-sized town in the kind of place where what your family thought of your choices carried more weight than what you actually wanted for your life. My mother, Loretta Stanhope, was a woman who had very specific ideas about what a respectable future looked like. And those ideas had been formed in a world that was about 30 years behind the one I was actually living in. To Loretta, a good life meant a local life. You stayed close. You married early. You took a stable job that kept you home by 5:30. You did not spend 4 years across the country at a medical school that cost more than the house she had raised us in, chasing a specialty that she had decided, without asking a single question about it, was impractical, self-indulgent, and above our station. Me. I was the second of 3 children and the only one who had ever looked at Tunbridge Falls and known, with quiet and complete certainty, that I was meant for something beyond it. Not because I thought I was better than anyone there, but because from the time I was 12 years old, sitting in the waiting room of Tunbridge General while my grandfather recovered from a neurological episode, I had watched the specialists come and go, calm, precise, purposeful, and felt something lock into place inside me that never unlocked. I was going to be a neurologist. It took me 7 years of focused, disciplined, relentless work to get there. Undergraduate on a partial academic scholarship. MCT prep on weekends while working a reception desk at a physical therapy clinic. Medical school acceptance to Harwell College of Medicine for states away, which was one of the finest programs in the country and which my mother referred to exclusively as that school for the entire 4 years I attended it. She did not come to my graduation. She said the drive was too far and the tickets were too expensive, and that a ceremony was just a ceremony and the important thing was that I had finished. I drove home alone 2 weeks after graduation with my degree packed carefully in a cardboard box between 2 textbooks so it wouldn't bend. I had been home for less than 40 minutes when she dropped it in the trash. I pulled the degree out of the trash can myself. I didn't say anything when I did it. I just reached in, lifted it out carefully, shook a coffee ground off the corner and set it on the counter. Then I stood there and waited for my mother to turn around. She took her time. When she finally faced me, her expression was not guilty. It was not apologetic. It was the particular expression Loretta Stanhope had been perfecting for as long as I could remember. The one that said she had already decided how this conversation was going to go and was simply waiting for me to catch up. "You don't need to fish it out like it's something precious," she said. "It's a piece of paper, Vivian." I told her it was my medical degree. "I know what it is. I'm telling you what it's worth in the real world." I asked her what she meant by that. She turned back to the stove, adjusted the heat on whatever she was cooking, and spoke to the wall above the burners the way she always did when she wanted to deliver a verdict without having to look at the person receiving it. "Neurology," she said with the specific inflection she reserved for things she considered pretentious. Asterisk, you couldn't have picked something practical. You couldn't have stayed at Tunbridge General where people actually know you. You had to go 4 states away and come back with a specialty that 3 people in this county will ever need. I told her that neurological conditions affected 1 in 6 people globally and that Tunbridge County had a documented shortage of specialist care that had been in the local paper twice in the past year. "Don't lecture me with statistics," she said. Asterisk, I'm your mother, not one of your professors. I picked up the degree from the counter and held it. "Why didn't you come to graduation?" I asked. It was not the question I had planned to ask. It came out before I could stop it, which meant it was the question I had actually been carrying the entire 4-hour drive home. Loretta was quiet for a moment. "I told you. The drive. It's 4 hours, Mom. You drove 6 hours to Aunt Cecilia's retirement party last spring." The silence that followed was a different quality of silence than the ones before it. Tighter. More deliberate. "That was family," she said finally. "I'm family," I said. He turned around then. And the expression on her face was not the verdict expression. It was something harder to categorize. Not guilt exactly. Not regret. Something closer to a conviction so deeply held that challenging it felt to her like a personal attack. "What you did," she said, "going off to that school, spending all that money, choosing a path that takes you away from this family for years. That is not what I raised you to do. I raised you to be here. To be present. To build something with the people who love you instead of chasing something that is always going to be one more degree, one more residency, one more fellowship away. I finished, Mom. I'm done. I'm here." "You're here for how long? Until the next opportunity pulls you somewhere else? Until some hospital in a city I've never been to offers you something you can't turn down?" I didn't answer that. Partly because I didn't have an answer yet. Partly because the honest answer, that yes, I would likely need to go where the work was, at least initially, was not the answer that was going to help anything in that kitchen on that afternoon. "I worked for this," I said instead, holding up the degree. "I worked for 4 years without asking you for a single dollar. I did this myself." "Nobody said you didn't work," Loretta said. "I'm saying the work took you somewhere I didn't want you to go. Those are two different things." He turned back to the stove. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. I stayed in Tunbridge Falls for 11 days after that. They were 11 of the most quietly suffocating days of my adult life. Loretta did not bring up the degree again. She did not apologize for dropping it in the trash. She moved around me in that house with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had decided that the subject was closed and that returning to it would be conceding something she had no intention of conceding. My younger brother, Fletcher, was still living at home at the time. He was 23, working a construction management job locally, engaged to a woman named Dana who Loretta adored. He was everything Loretta had wanted me to be. Present, rooted, building a life within the boundaries she understood and approved of. He pulled me aside on the 3rd day. "She's not going to apologize," he said. Not unkindly. Just factually, the way Fletcher delivered most things. I told him I knew that. "She told Aunt Cecilia you'd be back within 2 years. That once you got out there and realized how hard it was going to be, you'd come home and find something local." I looked at him. "She's been saying that since I got into Harwell," I said. Fletcher shrugged. "She believes it. You know how she is. If she says something enough times it becomes true in her head." I asked him what he thought. He looked at me for a moment with the particular expression of a younger sibling who has spent years quietly watching a dynamic they were never quite brave enough to name out loud. "I think," he said carefully, "that Mom has never been able to separate loving someone from needing them to stay small enough to keep." He went back to watching television after that, as though he hadn't just said the most precise thing anyone had ever said about our mother in my presence. I stood in the hallway for a long time after that conversation. On the 7th day, Loretta's sister, my Aunt Phyllis, came for dinner. Aunt Phyllis was the louder, warmer, more chaotic version of my mother. She had driven 40 minutes from Clermont to celebrate what she described as my niece coming home a doctor, which was the first time anyone in that house had used that word in my presence since I'd arrived. She hugged me for a long time when she walked in. "I watched that graduation live stream 3 times, she said into my shoulder. 3 times, Vivian. I cried every single one." I looked over her shoulder at my mother, who was arranging something on the dining table with great focus and concentration. Dinner was pleasant on the surface in the way that Stanhope family dinners always were, Conversation moving along familiar tracks. Nobody saying the thing that most needed to be said. Everyone performing a version of togetherness that was comfortable enough to sustain an evening but not honest enough to sustain much more than that. Toward the end of the meal, Aunt Phyllis raised her glass. "To Dr. Vivian Stanhope," she said. "Neurologist. The first doctor in this family. I want it on record that I am claiming full credit for encouraging her to apply to Harwell." Everyone laughed. Even my mother smiled. A small, controlled smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. After dinner, while Fletcher and Dana were doing dishes and Aunt Phyllis had stepped outside to call her husband, I found myself alone with Loretta in the living room for the first time since the kitchen confrontation. She was folding a throw blanket that didn't need folding. I sat down across from her. "Mom," I said, "I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back to Tunbridge Falls to practice. I have a fellowship position starting in 6 weeks at Crestwood Medical Center. It's one of the top neurology programs in the country. I worked for 3 years to get that placement." She folded the blanket, set it on the arm of the sofa, picked it up again. "I know," she said. "I need to know that you understand this is not a phase. This is not something I'm going to abandon when it gets hard. This is my career and my life, and I am good at it. I never said you weren't good at it. You threw my degree in the trash, Mom." She set the blanket down. "I was frustrated," she said. And for a single moment, just one, something shifted in her expression. Not an apology exactly, but the closest thing to one I was going to receive. "Frustrated about what?" I pressed. The moment closed. "About all of it," she said. "About the years. About the distance. About the fact that you chose something that means I am always going to be the last thing on your list. That's not true. Vivian. You will always choose the work. I know you. You have always chosen the work. And I have spent 4 years watching you disappear into something that I am not part of and that I don't understand and that keeps taking you further and further away." She stood up and straightened the blanket one final time. "So yes," she said quietly, "I was frustrated. And I'm not proud of how I showed it. But I am not going to pretend that I'm not losing something just because you're gaining something." He walked out of the living room. I sat in that chair for a long time after she left. I understood, in the way you sometimes understand things that hurt too much to fully absorb in the moment, that my mother was not a villain in this story. She was a woman who loved me in a language that required proximity and presence and constancy, and I had built a life that could not be lived in that language. That was real. That grief was real. But it did not make her right. And it did not mean I was going to fold myself back into the shape she needed me to be. I left Tunbridge Falls 4 days later. Loretta hugged me briefly at the door. Fletcher told me to call more. Aunt Phyllis sent 3 text messages before I had even reached the highway, all of them variations of "I'm so proud of you." I drove the 4 hours back to my apartment with my degree on the passenger seat beside me. Not in a box this time, not packed between textbooks. Just there. Visible. Present. I had stopped at a frame shop on my last morning in Tunbridge Falls and bought a simple dark wood frame. The degree was inside it, protected by glass, slightly too large for my passenger seat so that one corner pressed against the dashboard the entire drive. I didn't mind. I was going to hang it on the wall of my new office at Crestwood Medical Center the moment I arrived. And I did. I spent the next 6 years building a life that Loretta did not approve of and did not ask about. My fellowship at Crestwood Medical Center began on a Monday morning in September, in a city 4 states away from Tunbridge Falls, in a department that smelled like industrial cleaning solution and burnt coffee and the particular kind of purposeful exhaustion that collects in places where people are always at every hour trying to save something. I had driven up the night before. My car had 114,000 miles on it. I had 2 suitcases, a box of textbooks, a portable coffee maker, and my degree in its dark wood frame, which I had wrapped carefully in a bath towel for the drive. I found my apartment, a 1-bedroom on the 4th floor of a building 6 blocks from the hospital, unlocked the door, set the degree against the wall where I intended to hang it, and sat on the floor of the empty living room eating a gas station sandwich at 10:30 at night. I remember thinking, this is it. This is what you worked for. It didn't feel the way I had imagined it would. It felt quiet. A little lonely. Completely, irrevocably right. I started at 6 the next morning and did not leave the hospital until 9:15 that evening. I repeated that schedule with minor variations for the next 4 months. The fellowship was a 3-year program. The first year was the steepest, not just clinically but psychologically. Neurology at the specialist level is not a field that rewards arrogance or impatience. The brain does not behave predictably. It does not respond to urgency. It requires a particular quality of attention that I can only describe as disciplined humility. The willingness to sit with uncertainty long enough to actually understand what you're looking at before you move. My supervising physician during that first year was a woman named Dr. Annelies Varga. She was 61 years old, Hungarian by birth, with 30 years of clinical neurology behind her and the energy of someone half her age. She had a reputation in the department for being exacting, occasionally terrifying, and absolutely brilliant. She expected her fellows to arrive prepared, ask precise questions, and never, under any circumstances, pretend to know something they didn't. She called me into her office on my 3rd day. "Tell me why you chose neurology," she said, without looking up from whatever she was reading. I gave her the answer I had rehearsed for medical school interviews. Something about the complexity of the brain, the frontier nature of the research, the diagnostic challenge. She looked up. "That's the answer you give people who are evaluating you," she said. "Tell me the real one." I paused. "I was 12, I said. "My grandfather had a neurological episode." I sat in the waiting room at a county hospital and watched the specialists move through the ward, and I understood, in a way I couldn't articulate at 12 but have never stopped feeling since, that the work they were doing was the most important work I had ever seen anyone do. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was precise. Because it required someone to truly understand something rather than just respond to it. Dr. Varga looked at me for a moment. "That's a better answer," she said. "Don't give the first one again." She went back to her reading. I understood that the meeting was over. I walked out of her office and thought, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. The phone calls home continued on their 2-week schedule. They followed a reliable, managed pattern that I came to think of less as communication and more as a kind of maintenance. The minimum required to keep a connection from severing entirely while neither party was willing to do the work of actually repairing it. Fletcher would answer first, usually. He had married Dana by then. A small ceremony at the Turnbridge Falls Town Hall that I had driven back for, stayed 2 days and driven away from without having a single honest conversation with my mother. He would fill me in on local news. Who had moved? What was being built or torn down? How his work was going? Dana's mother's health. The ordinary, rooted, continuous texture of a life being lived in one place by people who had chosen to stay. Then Loretta would take the phone. "Are you eating?" "Yes, Mom." "Are you sleeping?" "Enough." "You sound tired." "I'm fine." Pause. The specific pause of two people who have agreed, without ever saying so explicitly, to remain on the surface of things. "Everything all right at the hospital?" "Yes." "Good week, actually. We had an interesting case. A patient presenting with." "That's good." She never wanted the details. I had understood that early on and had stopped offering them. Not bitterly, just practically. She didn't have the framework for what I was doing, and she had never tried to build one, and after the first year I stopped expecting her to. What I had not stopped hoping for, and this is the part that took me longer to admit, was that she might one day ask. Not understand. Not approve. Just ask. "What is it like? What do you do all day? What does it feel like when you help someone? What does it feel like when you can't?" She never did. And I carried that, quietly, efficiently, the way you carry things that have become too familiar to put down, through the 2nd year of my fellowship and into the 3rd. What is it like? What do you do all day? What does it feel like when you help someone? What does it feel like when you can't? He never did. And I carried that, quietly, efficiently, the way you carry things that have become too familiar to put down, through the second year of my fellowship and into the third. The third year was different from the first two in a way I hadn't anticipated. By then I was no longer the most junior person in the room. I had two new first-year fellows beneath me. I was assisting on cases I would have only observed 18 months earlier. Dr. Varga had started referring to me in departmental meetings in ways that I understood, without her ever saying so directly, constituted a form of professional endorsement that did not come easily from her. I had also, somewhere in the middle of the second year, started to understand what kind of neurologist I was becoming. I was not drawn to the research side. The lab work, the trials, the slow accumulation of data toward conclusions that might take a decade to matter clinically. I respected that work enormously. It was not mine. I was drawn to the patients, to the diagnostic process, to the moment, sometimes frightening, always clarifying, of sitting across from a person who was frightened and confused about what was happening in their own body, and being the one who could name it. Not fix it always, but name it, illuminate it, give it a shape that could be responded to. There is a particular kind of trust that a patient extends to a neurologist that I have never stopped finding humbling. You are asking them to trust you with their mind. Not their knee, not their blood pressure. Their cognition, their memory, their sense of self, their ability to recognize their own children. The stakes of that trust are unlike anything else in medicine. I had known that intellectually since I was 12. I understood it in my body by the time I was 30. I was good at it. I do not say that with arrogance. I say it because it is true and because it took me a long time to be able to say it plainly, without qualifying it into something smaller and more palatable. I was a good neurologist. I was becoming a very good one. Loretta did not know this. She had never asked. Then, in the spring of my third fellowship year, my grandfather had a second neurological episode. He was 79 years old. He had been in reasonable health. A mild hypertension diagnosis managed with medication, some arthritis in his hands, the ordinary diminishments of a man in his late 70s who had worked physically for most of his life. The first episode, 20 years earlier, had resolved without significant lasting deficit. He had been careful since then, as careful as someone of his generation and temperament could be persuaded to be. The second episode was different. It began on a Thursday evening. He was at home. Fletcher's wife Dana was visiting. She had taken to checking on him twice a week since my grandmother had passed 2 years prior, and she noticed that he was having difficulty finding words mid-sentence. Not struggling the way tired people struggle, reaching for something just out of reach. Stopping. Completely. Looking at her with an expression she described later as like he knew something was wrong but couldn't tell me what. She called an ambulance. She called Fletcher. Fletcher called Loretta. Loretta called me at 11:30 at night. I realized as the phone rang in my dark apartment, the first time she had called me outside of our scheduled fortnightly calls in over 2 years. Dad's been taken to Turnbridge General, she said. Her voice was controlled in the way that voices are controlled when the person speaking is applying significant effort to keep them that way. They're saying he needs to see a neurologist. I sat up. Turned on the lamp. What are his symptoms? I asked. Difficulty talking. Dana said he was confused. They've done some kind of scan. What did the scan show? The doctor said he'd explain it tomorrow when. Mom. Kept my voice level. I need you to go back to that doctor tonight and ask him to explain the scan results to you now. Tell him your daughter is a neurologist and is on the phone. Ask him specifically whether there is evidence of ischemic activity and what the NIHSS score is. Pause. Your daughter is she started. Then stopped. I waited. I'll go find him, she said. She was gone for 11 minutes. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, running differentials in my head, thinking about what the presentation suggested, thinking about the staffing at Turnbridge General, which I knew from the county health reports had no neurologist on staff and had been trying to recruit one for 3 years. When she came back, she relayed what the attending had told her. A GP, as I had expected, competent and clearly doing his best with the tools available to him. The scan suggested an ischemic event. The NIHSS score indicated moderate severity. He was stable but would require specialist assessment before treatment decisions could be made responsibly. The nearest neurologist was 40 miles away. Transfer was being delayed until morning due to blood pressure instability. What does that mean? Loretta asked. The delay. I chose my words carefully. It means the window for certain interventions may be narrowing, I said. It doesn't mean it's closed. But I need you to go back to that doctor and ask about TPA eligibility and why it's been ruled in or out. Can you do that? Vivian, I don't. Mom. I said it gently. I know this is a lot. I know you're frightened. I need you to be my hands in that building right now because I cannot be there. Can you do that for me? She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. And she went. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours that night. I walked her through every question to ask, every detail to relay back to me, every sign to watch for that would indicate a change in his condition requiring immediate escalation. She did everything I asked without complaint or hesitation, moving through that hospital corridor in the middle of the night with a focus and a steadiness that I had always known she was capable of, had watched her deploy in every domestic crisis of my childhood, now aimed finally at something I had directed. At 1:40 in the morning she came back to the phone and said, "The doctor says he's stable. They're going to monitor through the night and transfer at 6. I exhaled. Hey, I said. That's okay. That's the right call given his pressure. A silence. Different from the silences of our regular calls. Less managed. You knew exactly what to ask, she said. Yes. You knew what the scan meant. Before he even explained it. Yes. Another silence. How long have you been able to do that? She asked. It was, in its way, the closest thing to the question I had been waiting for her to ask for 6 years. Not asked with wonder exactly. Not with pride. With something quieter than both of those things. A kind of recalibration, careful and slow, of a fixed idea that had just been confronted with evidence it could no longer comfortably ignore. A while, I said. My grandfather was transferred at 6:15 the following morning. He received a full neurological assessment by 8. He was diagnosed with a lacunar ischemic stroke, a diagnosis that, had it been identified and acted upon 6 hours earlier by a specialist physically present at Turnbridge General, would have significantly expanded the treatment options available to him. He recovered. Slowly, with some residual difficulty in word retrieval that improved over the following months with speech therapy, but he recovered. He was home by the end of the following week. The 6-hour gap stayed with me. And something else stayed with me. Loretta had said toward the very end of that phone call, just before we hung up, tired, raw, the careful management of her usual register worn down to something more unguarded. I don't know how you carry this. Knowing all of this and not being able to fix everything. It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years. You learn too, I told her. It takes time. She said goodnight. We hung up. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. Not crying. Not angry. Just sitting with the weight of it. The grandfather who had almost been lost to a gap in care that didn't have to exist. The mother who had just for the first time looked at what I did and seen something other than an absence. I made a decision that night. Not a dramatic one. Not a vengeful one. Not the kind of decision that announces itself. I was simply done waiting. Done measuring my worth against her silence. Done hoping the call would come where she would finally ask the right question early enough to matter. Done carrying the quiet grief of being known by my mother only as the daughter who left, rather than the doctor who had spent 6 years learning to stay present in the most demanding possible sense of that word, in the lives of people who needed her most. I had a meeting with Dr. Varga the following Monday. She was considering me for a senior clinical position. A role that would keep me at Crestwood, deepen my research involvement, and position me for a department head track within the decade. I told her I needed to think about it. She looked at me over her reading glasses for a long moment. "Think quickly," she said. "The offer won't wait." I thought about it for exactly 4 days. I thought about Tunbridge Falls, 40 miles from a neurologist. I thought about a county hospital that had been trying to recruit specialist cover for 3 years. I thought about a waiting room I had sat in at age 12 and the specialists who had moved through it with calm and purpose, and the sense, which I had absorbed through the walls of that room and never let go of, that this kind of work was the most important work there was. I thought about my grandfather's word retrieval. The 6-hour gap. I thought about Loretta's voice at 1:40 in the morning, stripped of its management, asking, "How long have you been able to do that?" On the 4th day, I called Dr. Varga and told her I would not be taking the Crestwood position. She was quiet for a moment. "Where are you going?" she asked. I told her. Another pause. "The county with no neurologist," she said. "Yes. That's a hard practice to build." "I know." She was quiet again. Then, "Good. The hard ones are where the work matters most." She paused. "Don't waste it." I told her I wouldn't. I hung up and started making calls. I moved back to the county 3 months later. Not to Tunbridge Falls itself. I want to be precise about that. I was not ready for that, for the daily proximity of my mother's kitchen and Fletcher's well-meaning updates and the particular suffocation of being known, in a town the size of Tunbridge Falls, primarily as Loretta Stanhope's daughter who had gone away and come back. I needed to be somewhere close enough to matter and far enough to breathe. I found a rental in Aldermore, a small, quiet town 11 miles from Tunbridge Falls, 22 miles from the county hospital where my grandfather had spent that long Thursday night, and 38 miles from the nearest neurologist, who was a good physician running a practice stretched far beyond what one person could reasonably cover. I signed a lease on a 2-bedroom ground floor unit on a street lined with oak trees that were just beginning to turn. I unpacked my 2 suitcases, my box of textbooks, my portable coffee maker. I hung my degree on the wall of what would become my home office. Same dark wood frame, same glass, the corner that had pressed against the dashboard of my car during that drive years ago still faintly scuffed. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I went to work. Building a specialist practice from the ground up in a rural county is not a process that rewards impatience. It is slow, unglamorous, logistically demanding work that has almost nothing in common with the clinical environment I had trained in and everything in common with the kind of sustained, methodical effort that had gotten me through undergraduate and medical school and 3 years of fellowship in the first place. The county had one hospital, Aldermore County Medical Center, a 180-bed facility that handled general medicine, emergency care, obstetrics, and basic surgical procedures, and which had been managing its neurology referrals by sending patients 40 miles in either direction for the better part of a decade. The chief of medicine was a 63-year-old internist named Dr. Raymond Chu, who had been trying to recruit specialist cover in neurology, cardiology, and orthopedics for the better part of 5 years and who, when I called him to introduce myself and explain what I was proposing, went so quiet that I checked the phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "You trained at Crestwood," he said. 3-year fellowship, yes. Under Dr. Annalise Varga. Another pause. "And you want to come here?" "Yes." "Why?" I gave him the real answer. The one Dr. Varga had taught me to give. He listened without interrupting, which I would come to understand was rare for Raymond Chu and constituted, in his particular language, a form of serious attention. When I finished, he said, "When can you start?" I joined the staff at Aldermore County Medical Center on a Tuesday in November. My first week I saw 11 patients. My second week, 19. By the end of my first month I had a referral backlog that stretched 6 weeks out, because the news that there was now a neurologist physically present in the county, not a visiting consultant, not a telehealth arrangement, but an actual specialist you could call on a Thursday night and who would be there by Friday morning, moved through the county's medical community faster than I had anticipated. GPs who had been managing neurological presentations with one hand tied behind their backs for years began referring with a relief that was almost palpable in their letters. Patients who had been putting off assessments because the nearest specialist was 40 miles away and they didn't drive or couldn't afford the time or simply hadn't prioritized a 2-hour round trip for a symptom they were still hoping would resolve on its own. Those patients started appearing in my waiting room with histories that were sometimes years long. I saw things in that first year that should have been caught earlier. Not because the local physicians were inadequate. Most of them were skilled, dedicated practitioners working in conditions of genuine resource scarcity, but because the gap between a general practitioner doing their best and a specialist with the right training is, in neurology, a gap that has consequences. Real ones. Ones I could measure in delayed diagnoses and treatment windows that had narrowed unnecessarily in patients who had lived for months with something nameable that nobody had been equipped to name. I named them. That is what I did every day in that clinic in Aldermore. I named things. I illuminated them. I gave patients and their families the shape of what they were dealing with so that they could respond to it rather than simply endure it. It was the most meaningful work I had ever done. It was also, in strictly practical terms, extraordinarily demanding. My days in that first year followed a rhythm that left almost no space for anything else. I was typically at the hospital by 6:30 for ward rounds. My clinic started at 8 and ran until 1, with a working lunch that was not really a lunch so much as an opportunity to review afternoon files while eating whatever I had managed to pack that morning. Afternoons were a combination of follow-up consultations, case reviews, correspondence with referring physicians, and the ongoing administrative architecture of a practice that was, in its first year, still being built from the ground up. Credentialing, referral protocols, documentation systems, the 100 small structural decisions that nobody in medical school prepares you for and that fall entirely on your shoulders when you are the only specialist in your field within a 40-mile radius. I was usually back at my desk at home by 8 in the evening. I ate late. I slept 6 hours on good nights. I ran on Saturday mornings because Dr. Varga had told me once with characteristic directness that a neurologist who didn't take care of their own brain was practicing a form of professional negligence. And because the oak-lined streets of Aldermore at 7 in the morning were genuinely beautiful in a way that reminded me, on the mornings when I needed reminding, why I had come back. I did not have much of a social life that first year. I had colleagues I respected and was beginning to trust. I had a relationship with Raymond Chu that had evolved over the first 6 months, from cautious professional courtesy into something warmer. A mutual regard grounded in the recognition that we were both, in our different ways, committed to the same problem. I had weekly calls with Dr. Varga, who had made clear that her retirement from formal mentorship did not extend to me, and who I suspected was quietly tracking my practice's growth with the particular proprietary satisfaction of someone who has invested significantly in an outcome they intend to see through. And I had the patience. That was, in the end, what filled the space. Not in a compensatory way, not as a substitute for other things, but because the work was genuinely, continuously absorbing in a way that made isolation feel less like deprivation and more like focus. I did not tell Loretta initially that I had moved back to the county. I am aware of how that sounds. I want to explain it accurately. It was not a calculated withholding. It was not revenge or punishment or a setup for a later revelation. It was something simpler and less dramatic than any of those things. I knew that if I told my mother I had moved 11 miles from Turnbridge Falls, the conversation that would follow, the questions, the assumptions, the inevitable recalibration of her expectations about what my proximity meant for our relationship, would require a kind of emotional bandwidth that I did not, in those first months of building the practice, have available. I needed to build the thing first. I needed it to be real and established and mine before I brought it into contact with her particular set of opinions about it. So I said nothing. I continued calling every 2 weeks. I continued answering her surface questions with surface answers. Are you eating? Yes, Mom. Are you sleeping? Enough. The familiar, managed pattern of our maintenance calls. Fletcher found out first. Not because I told him, but because Dana's cousin worked in administration at Aldermore County Medical Center and mentioned, during a family dinner, that the new neurologist had a Tunbridge Falls connection. Fletcher called me on a Saturday morning. "You're in Aldermore," he said. "Yes." "Since November." "Yes." Pause. Not an angry one. Fletcher rarely did anger. He did something quieter and more considered. A kind of stillness that meant he was deciding what he actually thought about something before he said it. "Does Mom know?" "Not yet." "Vivian." "I know. She's going to." "I know, Fletcher. I'll tell her." He was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you tell her straight away?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I needed to build it without her having opinions about it while I was building it," I said. "Because the practice is real now. It's established. It's not a plan or a possibility, it's a thing that exists. And I needed it to exist before I let her weigh in on whether it should." Fletcher was quiet for a long moment. "That's the most Vivian Stanhope thing you have ever said," he said finally. I laughed. It surprised me, a genuine sudden laugh that I hadn't expected. It was the first time I had laughed properly in a while. "Give me a week," I told him. "I'll call her." I called Loretta on a Tuesday evening 7 days later. I had rehearsed what I was going to say, which was unlike me. I was not, generally, a person who rehearsed personal conversations. But I wanted to be precise. I wanted to give her the facts without framing them as either an announcement requiring her approval or a confrontation requiring her response. I wanted to simply tell her what was true. "Mom," I said when she picked up, "I have something to tell you." "What's happened?" Immediately, reflexively, the assumption of crisis that is the permanent background frequency of a certain kind of motherhood. "Nothing bad. I've moved. I'm in Aldermore. I've been here since November." The silence that followed was long enough that I would have checked the call again if I hadn't been able to hear her breathing. "Aldermore," she said. "Yes." "That's 11 miles. "Yes." "You've been 11 miles away since November." "Yes." Another silence. I let it sit. I had learned, somewhere in the previous 6 years, not to fill Loretta's silences with preemptive justification. She was processing. She would get to her response in her own time and in her own way, and whatever I said before she got there would only give her something to push against. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said finally. "Because I needed to establish the practice first," I said. "I needed it to be real before I talked about it. You didn't trust me." I considered that. "I didn't want to need your approval for something I had already decided," I said. "That's not the same thing as not trusting you." A very long silence. "You're working at the county hospital," she said. Not a question. Dana's cousin had clearly made further appearances at the Stanhope family dinner table. "Aldermore County Medical Center, yes. I'm the neurologist on staff." "The only one." "The only one." She went quiet again. When she spoke, her voice had shifted, not to warmth exactly, not to the open, uncomplicated pride that a different kind of mother might have offered in that moment, but to something less defended than usual. "A crack in the managed surface, small but real. That's where they would have sent your grandfather," she said. "If the transfer had gone differently." "That's the hospital." "Yes," I said. "That's partly why." She didn't respond to that. I hadn't expected her to. The connection between those two things, the night of the phone call, the 6-hour gap, the decision I had made 4 days later sitting in my dark apartment at Crestwood, was not something I was going to explain to her in a single phone call. Maybe not ever. Some things are understood privately and don't require an audience. "Are you eating?" she said finally. I almost laughed again. "Yes, Mom," I said. "I'm eating." The practice grew steadily through the 2nd and 3rd years. By the end of year 2, my referral backlog had shrunk from 6 weeks to 3, Not because demand had decreased but because I had worked with Raymond Chu to bring in a nurse practitioner with neurology training who handled the lower acuity cases and freed me for the complex ones. By the end of year 3, we were in early conversations with a regional medical school about establishing Aldermore County as a training site for neurology residents, which would, if it came through, mean more specialist hands in the county and a sustainable pipeline of coverage that didn't depend entirely on one person. I was also by then building a reputation. Not the kind of reputation that generates press releases or professional awards, although those came eventually. The kind that travels through communities the way useful things travel. Quietly, person to person, through the specific incredible medium of someone saying to someone else, "She figured out what was wrong with my mother. She explained it in a way we could understand. She was there when we called." I heard versions of that sentence regularly enough that I stopped being surprised by it and started simply receiving it as information about the kind of practice I was running. I was 34 years old. I had a waiting room that was never empty. I had a team I trusted. I had a referral network that extended across the county and into 2 neighboring ones. I had a home with oak trees outside the window and a degree on the wall of my office, and the kind of tiredness at the end of a day that comes from having done work that genuinely mattered. I had built something. Not the thing Loretta had imagined for me when she formed her picture of a good life. Not the thing she would have chosen even now if the choice had been hers. But something real. Something needed. Something that would outlast the politics of a small town's expectations and a mother's particular fear of distance. The calls continued on their 2-week schedule. They were different by year 3. Not transformed. Not warm in the unguarded, effortless way that warmth is warm when it has never been interrupted. But different. Longer. More specific. She had started sometime in the 2nd year asking questions about the work. Careful questions still. Pause. But questions. What kind of cases do you see mostly? Are there enough patients? Is the hospital supportive? Small questions. Surface level still. But asked. And I answered them. Carefully, in the way you handle something newly fragile. Not with drama, not with the weight of everything that had preceded it. Just answered them. Built the habit of it. Let it become, slowly and without announcement, a different kind of call. She never apologized for the degree. I had stopped waiting for that a long time ago. What I had instead was this. A Tuesday evening phone call during which my mother, Loretta Stanhope, who had once told me that a medical degree was a waste of paper, asked me how my patients were doing. And I told her. I did not know, sitting in my office in Aldermore on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon in my 4th year of practice, reviewing the afternoon's referral list, that one of the names on that list was about to change everything. I did not know it because the name meant nothing to me at first glance. It came through on a standard referral form from a GP in Tunbridge Falls. A Dr. Hargreaves who had been one of my most reliable referring physicians since my 1st year and whose clinical notes I had come to trust for their precision and their appropriate level of alarm. The presenting complaint was cognitive, word-finding difficulties, some memory inconsistency, 2 episodes of what the patient described as spacing out in the previous month. The patient was 64 years old. The patient's name was Loretta Stanhope. I sat with the referral form in my hands for a long moment. Then I set it down, picked up the phone and called Dr. Hargreaves. "You referred a patient," I said. "Loretta Stanhope." "Yes," he said. "Is there a conflict?" I thought about the degree in the trash. The graduation ceremony she didn't attend. The 11-minute silence while she went to find a doctor in a hospital corridor at midnight. The crack in her voice on a Tuesday phone call when she said, "That's the hospital. That's where they would have sent him." "No," I said. "No conflict. I'll see her." The appointment was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks out. I had set it myself. I had looked at my calendar, found the slot, typed the name into the system with my own hands rather than asking my receptionist to do it, which was not my usual process and which I recognized even as I did it as a form of control. A need to manage the entry of this particular thing into my professional world with a precision that felt necessary even if it was largely symbolic. Loretta Stanhope. Thursday. 9:15. I closed the scheduling window and went back to my afternoon cases. I did not call her to tell her I had received the referral. I thought about it. I thought about it for several days, turning it over the way you turn over a decision that has consequences in multiple directions and no clearly correct answer. She would find out when she arrived. She might find out sooner from Dr. Hargreaves, or from the appointment confirmation letter that the clinic system automatically generated, which would have my name on it. In the end, I decided not to call. Not because I was avoiding the conversation. I had stopped avoiding conversations with my mother some years ago, having realized that the avoidance cost more than the conversation, but because I genuinely did not know what to say. I received your referral was clinical and strange. I know your coming in was obvious. I want to talk about what this means before you get here. Assumed a level of emotional openness that our relationship, improved as it was, had not yet fully reached. So I waited. The confirmation letter went out. She would read my name on it. What she did with that information before Thursday was her business. I went back to work. I want to tell you about those 3 weeks honestly because I think the honest version is more useful than a tidier one. I did not spend those 3 weeks consumed by anticipation. I did not lie awake composing speeches or rehearsing how the appointment might go or cataloging the years of distance between us in preparation for some kind of confrontation. I worked. I saw patients. I ran on Saturday mornings. I had my weekly call with Dr. Varga, who I did not tell about the referral because I was not yet ready to say it out loud to someone who would respond to it with the full weight of her attention. What I did do in the spaces between things was think about the clinical picture. This is what being a neurologist does to you. Eventually, it gives you a framework for anxiety that is more productive than ordinary worry. Instead of sitting with the fear of what might be wrong with someone you love, you sit with the differential. You follow the evidence. You give the uncertainty a shape. Word-finding difficulties. Memory inconsistency. 2 episodes of what the patient described as spacing out. Age 64. No prior neurological history documented. Referred by a GP whose clinical instincts I trusted. The differential was wide. It included things that were manageable, stress-related cognitive changes, sleep disruption, early-stage conditions that responded well to intervention when caught at this point. It also included things that were more serious. That was true of every referral I received. It was not more or less true because the patient was my mother. I told myself that. With some regularity over those 3 weeks. It was true. It was also not entirely sufficient, which I acknowledged privately and set aside, because there was nothing to be done with the insufficiency until Thursday. Thursday came. I was in the clinic by 6:30 as usual. I saw 2 early patients before 9. At 9:10 I was at my desk reviewing Loretta's referral notes one more time when my receptionist, a steady and perceptive woman named Grace, knocked on the door frame. "Your 9:15 is here," she said. And then, because Grace had worked with me for 3 years and missed very little, "She's your mother." It was not a question. "Yes," I said. Grace looked at me for a moment. "Do you want me to?" "I'm fine," I said. "Give me 2 minutes, then bring her through." Grace nodded and went. I sat at my desk for those 2 minutes and did something I had learned from Dr. Varga in my first fellowship year, when she had found me visibly rattled after a particularly difficult patient conversation and had sat me down and said with characteristic economy, "Before you walk into a room, decide who you are in that room. Then be that person completely. You can be something else afterwards." I decided who I was. I was Dr. Vivian Stanhope, neurologist, the specialist in this building, the person in this county most qualified to assess what was happening and to navigate it with clarity and care. I was also Loretta's daughter. That was true simultaneously and did not cancel the first thing. I stood up, straightened my coat, walked to the door. She looked smaller than I remembered. That is the first thing I noticed, and I notice it now with the particular awareness that it was not a clinical observation. It was a daughter's observation, the shock of seeing a parent reduced by time in a way that accumulates invisibly between visits and then announces itself all at once. She was 64 years old. She was dressed carefully, the way Loretta always dressed for appointments, not formally, but with the particular neatness of a woman who considered it a form of respect to present yourself properly to a situation that required your attention. Her hair was shorter than the last time I had seen her, which had been at Fletcher's 40th birthday dinner 8 months ago. She was sitting in the chair across from my desk with her hands folded in her lap and an expression that I recognized immediately, and that cost me something to see. She was frightened. Not in the way she had been frightened on the phone that night in the hospital corridor. That had been acute, adrenaline-edged fear, the fear of something happening in real time. This was different. This was the low, steady, grinding fear of someone who has been noticing things about themselves for weeks or months and has finally, reluctantly, agreed to let someone else look. She looked up when I came in. We looked at each other for a moment. "Hi, Mom," I said. "Hi," she said. And then, after a pause that contained approximately 35 years of everything that had ever happened between us, "I didn't know it would be you." "The letter had my name on it," I said, sitting down across from her. "I know. She stopped. Restarted. "I didn't know what to do with that, so I came anyway." I looked at her. "I'm glad you did." She nodded. Looked at her hands. "I need you to be the doctor right now," she said. "Not," she paused. "I need this to be a medical appointment." "It is," I said. "That's exactly what it is." She looked up at me then, and something in her expression settled. Not relaxed exactly, but resolved. She had made a decision to be here. She was going to honor that decision. "All right," she said. "Then ask me your questions." I took her history methodically, the way I took every history, starting broad and narrowing, following the thread of each symptom to its edges, noting what she said and how she said it and what she reached for when language briefly failed her, which happened twice during the 45 minutes we sat in that room. Both times she stopped mid-sentence. Not dramatically, not the way it appears in films, some sudden terrible blankness. Quietly. A word that should have been there wasn't, and she sat with the gap for 2 or 3 seconds before it returned, or she found a way around it. Both times she looked at me immediately after. Not with the blankness of someone who hasn't noticed. With the sharp, frightened attention of someone who has been noticing exactly this for weeks and has been cataloging each occurrence with the grim precision of a woman who has always, whatever else you could say about her, paid close attention to the world around her. "It keeps doing that," she said after the second time. "I know," I said. "I'm watching." "Is that," she stopped. Chose her words. "Is that significant?" "It's information," I said. "I'm not going to tell you what it means before I know what it means. That wouldn't be responsible." He accepted that. I had expected her to push. Loretta's relationship with uncertainty had never been comfortable. But she accepted it, and I understood that this was what fear did sometimes, when it had been sitting with someone long enough. It made them willing to wait. To trust. To hand something over to someone else rather than insist on managing it themselves. I continued the history. The first episode she described as spacing out had occurred 7 weeks ago. She had been in the kitchen. She specified this with the precision of someone who had replayed it many times. Making tea. She had become aware that she was standing at the counter holding the kettle and that she was not sure how long she had been standing there. The kettle had boiled. The tea was made. She had no memory of making it. It had lasted, she estimated, less than a minute. The second episode had been 3 weeks later. She had been talking to Fletcher on the phone and had become aware, mid-conversation, that he was saying her name with a particular quality of alarm, and that she had apparently not responded to something he had said for what he later told her was about 45 seconds. "He wanted to call an ambulance," she said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was fine." "Were you?" Pause. "No," she said. "But I wasn't ready to." she stopped. Started again. I needed to think about it first. I wrote. I did not look up from my notes because if I looked up at that moment I was not certain I would maintain the clinical distance I needed to maintain, and she needed the clinical distance more than she needed my feelings about it. Has this happened before either of those 2 episodes? I asked. Anything smaller? A moment of confusion, a brief lapse, something you noticed and then set aside. A very long pause. Yes, she said quietly. I've been setting things aside for about 4 months. I wrote that down. Why did you wait 4 months? I asked. My voice was level. A genuine clinical question. She was quiet for a moment. Because, she said, I was afraid of what someone would tell me. I looked up then. I couldn't help it. She was looking directly at me, not with the defended, controlled expression of the Loretta I had grown up with, but with something unguarded and exhausted and entirely vulnerably honest. And then I thought, she continued, that if I had to be afraid of what someone was going to tell me, I would rather it was you. The room was very quiet. I held her gaze for a moment. Then I said with everything I had, then you came to the right place. The neurological examination took 30 minutes. I was thorough. I was precise. I was, as she had asked me to be, the doctor in the room, fully, without reservation, without the distortion of personal history pulling at the edges of my clinical judgment. What I found was enough to warrant further investigation and not enough to warrant immediate alarm, which was the most honest summary I could give and which I gave her plainly at the end of the examination. I want to order an MRI and an EEG, I told her. The MRI will give us a structural picture. The EEG will help me understand the episodes, the ones you're calling spacing out. I have a specific question about what's causing those and I need the data to answer it responsibly. What's your question? She asked. I looked at her. She met my eyes steadily. I want to rule out a seizure disorder, I said. The episodes you're describing, the duration, the post-episode clarity, the fact that you have no memory of the kettle, are consistent with a type of seizure called an absence seizure. They're not the kind most people picture when they hear the word seizure. They're brief. They're quiet. They're frequently missed for exactly this reason. She absorbed that. I watched her absorb it. The careful, methodical way she processed information that frightened her, the same way she had processed the information I had given her over the phone that night in the hospital corridor. And if it is that? She asked. If it is, I said, it is manageable. There are highly effective medications. People with well-controlled absence seizure disorders live completely normal lives. The key is diagnosis, catching it, naming it, treating it appropriately. And if it's not that, she said, if it's something else, then we find out what the something else is, I said, and we address that. One step at a time. I am not going to speculate beyond the data I have. She nodded slowly. You're very calm, she said. This is what I do, I said. She looked at me for a moment. A long, careful look that I felt in a place that had nothing to do with the clinical encounter and everything to do with 35 years of being her daughter. Yes, she said quietly. I suppose it is. I walked her out to reception myself. Grace looked up as we came through, took in the two of us, the particular quality of the silence between us, which was not a comfortable silence but was no longer a defended one, and directed her attention back to her screen with the tact of someone who understood precisely what she was looking at and had decided it was not her business. At the door Loretta stopped. She had her coat on, her bag over her arm. She was composed again, the surface management back in place, not as a wall this time but as the ordinary functional composure of a woman who had just done something hard and was now preparing to walk back out into a world that did not know she had done it. He turned to me. Vivian, she said. Mom. She seemed to be deciding something. I waited. I should have come to graduation, she said. It was not an apology for everything. It was not the conversation we had needed to have for 15 years, compressed into a single sentence. She knew that and I knew that. It was one specific thing named plainly, offered without qualifier or excuse. I looked at her for a moment. Yes, I said. You should have. She nodded. She had not expected me to disagree with her. I'll call you when the imaging is scheduled, I said. Probably within the week. All right, she said. She opened the door. Started through it. Stopped one more time. You're good at this, she said without turning around. I can tell. She walked out. I stood in the doorway for a moment, the cool morning air coming in around me. Then Grace said from her desk without looking up from her screen, Your 950 is here, Dr. Stanhope. Thank you, Grace, I said. I went back to work. The MRI was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The EEG for Thursday of the same week. I had arranged for a colleague, a radiologist I trusted named Dr. Priya Mehta, who worked out of the regional hospital and who had been a quiet, reliable presence in my professional network since my second year in Aldermore, to read the MRI personally rather than leaving it to the general pool. I told her it was a patient I had a particular interest in. She didn't ask why. She said she'd call me when she had the images. I went home that Thursday evening and sat in my office for a while. Not at my desk. In the chair by the window, the one I sat in when I wasn't working, looking out at the oak trees on the street outside. My degree was on the wall across from me. Same dark wood frame. Same scuffed corner. The late afternoon light was catching the glass at an angle that made it harder to read than usual, the letters blurring slightly in the glare. I had looked at that degree on that wall hundreds of times in 4 years. That evening I looked at it differently. Not with pride exactly. Pride had never been the primary feeling associated with it. Too much had happened around it for pride to be simple. With something more complicated. A recognition of the distance between the kitchen in Turnbridge Falls, where it had landed in a bin on top of coffee grounds and vegetable peelings, and this room, this wall, this practice, this Thursday afternoon on which the woman who had dropped it there had sat across from me in a clinic chair and said, I would rather it was you. The distance was not nothing. It was not everything either. There was still a great deal that had not been said between us and might never be. There was still the shape of a relationship that had been formed in loss and distance and the long, quiet attrition of two people who loved each other in languages that didn't quite overlap. That was real. It was not resolved by a single clinical appointment and a forward sentence at a door. But it was something. I sat with it for a while. Then I got up, made tea and went back to my desk to review the next day's cases. There was work to do. There was always work to do. And in 3 days I would have imaging results and I would call my mother and we would take the next step together. Dr. Priya Mehta called me on a Wednesday afternoon. I was between patients. A 10-minute window that I had learned over 4 years of practice to treat as genuinely 10 minutes and not an invitation to start something that would run over. I was at my desk with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a referral letter. I was halfway through when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I picked up immediately. I have your images, she said. Go ahead. She went through the MRI findings methodically, the way good radiologists do. Structure first, then significance, no editorializing until the full picture was on the table. I listened without interrupting, making notes in the margin of the referral letter I had been writing, my handwriting getting smaller and more compressed the way it always did when I was concentrating hard. When she finished, I was quiet for a moment. Hey, I said. The EEG is going to tell you more about the episodes, she said. But structurally, it's not what I'd call reassuring, Vivian. You already know that. I know, I said. Thank you, Priya. For doing it personally. Of course, she said. And then, because she was perceptive and because we had known each other long enough. Are you all right? I looked at my cold coffee. At the half-finished referral letter. At the degree on the wall across from my desk, catching the afternoon light. I will be, I said. I'll call you after the EEG. I hung up. Sat for a moment. Then picked up the referral letter and finished it, because there was a patient waiting on the other end of it and my feelings about Priya Mehta's phone call were not relevant to their care. I went back to work. The EEG results came through on Friday morning. They confirmed what the clinical picture had been suggesting since Loretta had sat across from me in the clinic chair and gone quiet mid-sentence twice, and looked at me afterward with the sharp, frightened attention of someone who had been keeping score. The episodes were seizure activity. Absence seizures, as I had suspected, brief, quiet, the kind that don't announce themselves with the drama that the word seizure implies but that are real and measurable and, left unaddressed, progressive. The MRI findings were more complex. There were structural changes, subtle but present and significant to a trained eye, that were consistent with early-stage small vessel cerebrovascular disease. Not a dramatic finding in isolation. Common, in fact, in patients her age with her blood pressure history. But in combination with the seizure activity, in combination with the word-finding difficulties, in combination with 4 months of quietly setting things aside and hoping they would resolve on their own, in combination the picture required a serious, honest conversation and a treatment plan that was going to ask something of her. I sat with both sets of results for the better part of Friday afternoon, building the full clinical picture in my mind the way I had been trained to build it, not rushing to the conclusion, not letting the personal weight of the case pull me toward either excessive alarm or its opposite, the false comfort of minimizing. I looked at it clearly. It was manageable. That was true and important, and I held on to it. It was manageable if addressed now, properly, with the right medication protocol and the right lifestyle modifications and the right monitoring schedule. The seizures were controllable. I had patients in my practice who had been seizure-free for years on the right anticonvulsant. The cerebrovascular changes were early enough that intervention could meaningfully slow progression. The word early was doing significant work in that assessment, and I knew it. I called Loretta on Friday evening. She answered on the second ring. "The results are back," I said. "I know," she said. "I've been waiting." I had thought during the week about how to have this conversation. Whether to have it over the phone or in person. Whether to ask her to come back to the clinic, to sit across from me in the formal structure of a medical appointment where the roles were clear and the setting provided its own kind of scaffolding. In the end, I had decided against that. Not because the information was informal, it wasn't, but because what Loretta needed from this conversation was not clinical distance. She had had that on Thursday. She had asked for it and I had given it, and it had been exactly right for that moment. This moment was different. This moment she needed her daughter. "I want to tell you what I found," I said. "And I want to tell you clearly, so I need you to let me get through it before you respond. Can you do that?" Pause. "Yes." I told her. Plainly, precisely, without euphemism but also without the clinical vocabulary that would have created distance between her and the information she needed to receive. I told her about the absence seizures, what they were, what they weren't, what they meant in practical terms for her daily life. I told her about the cerebrovascular findings, what I had seen, what it indicated, what the trajectory looked like with and without intervention. I told her it was manageable. I told her that word carefully, with the weight it deserved. Not as reassurance designed to soften a blow, but as a clinical statement of fact grounded in the data in front of me. Manageable means it requires management, I said. It doesn't mean it goes away. It means we address it properly and we stay ahead of it and you live your life. The silence on the other end was long. When she spoke, her voice was controlled. I could hear the effort of the control, which was different from the effortless management of ordinary Loretta. This was conscious, deliberate, a woman applying everything she had to staying level. "Will it get worse?" she asked. "The seizures with medication should reduce significantly and in many cases stop. The cerebrovascular changes, I want to be honest with you. They are what they are. We can slow the progression meaningfully with the right interventions. We cannot reverse what is already there. So it will get worse," she said. "Without treatment, yes. With treatment, I cannot promise you a straight line. I can promise you that we are catching this early enough that treatment makes a real difference. That is not something I would say if it weren't true." Another silence. "How early?" she asked. "Early enough," I said. "That matters, Mom. I need you to hear that. If you had waited another year, if Dr. Hargreaves hadn't referred you, if you had kept setting things aside, the picture I would be describing to you would be a different one. I heard her breath catch. Very slightly. Quickly controlled. But you're not describing that picture, she said. No, I said. I'm not. We stayed on the phone for an hour and 20 minutes. I walked her through the treatment plan in full. The anticonvulsant I intended to prescribe and why, the blood pressure management adjustments I was going to coordinate with Dr. Hargreaves, the follow-up imaging schedule, the lifestyle modifications that the cerebrovascular findings made genuinely important rather than merely advisable. He asked questions. More than I had expected, and better ones. Precise, specific questions that told me she had been sitting with the possibility of this conversation for long enough to have thought carefully about what she needed to understand. At one point she asked about driving. I told her the truth. That until the seizures were controlled and we had a period of documented seizure-free time on record, I needed her to stop driving. It was not optional. It was a legal requirement and a safety one, and I was not going to soften it. She was quiet for a moment. Fletcher will have to drive me, she said. Yes. He won't mind. No, I said. He won't. Another pause. Then, he's going to be upset. About the diagnosis. Do you want me to be there when you tell him? The pause this time was different in quality from the others. Surprised, I thought. Recalibrating. You would do that, she said. Yes, I said. Of course. She was quiet for a long moment. I'll call him tomorrow, she said. And yes, I'd like you there. I drove to Turnbridge Falls on Saturday morning for the first time in 8 months. The oak trees on my street in Aldermore were fully bare by then. The drive took 11 minutes. I had made it in my head 1,000 times over 4 years. The distance between my life and hers, measured in miles that were smaller than the distance had ever felt. Fletcher opened the door before I reached it. He looked at my face and then looked at Loretta, who was standing in the hallway behind him, and I watched him understand that something had shifted, not catastrophically but fundamentally, and that the three of us were about to sit down together and talk about it in a way that the Stanhope family had not historically been good at. Dana made tea. Fletcher sat close to Loretta on the sofa. I sat across from them both and told him what I had told her, with the same clarity and the same honesty and the same careful weight on the word manageable. He cried. Briefly, quietly, turned away from us both, the way Fletcher cried, as though he owed it to himself to feel it fully and owed it to everyone else not to make it their problem. Loretta put her hand on his arm. It was such a simple gesture. So ordinary. The automatic comfort of a mother for her child. I watched it and felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was held. When Fletcher had composed himself, he looked at me. She's going to be all right, he said. Not a question. The specific inflection of a younger sibling deciding to trust his older sister completely. She's going to be all right, I said. Loretta looked at me across the room. She didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The degree had been on my wall for 4 years. She had been in my clinic chair. She had heard me describe her own brain to her with a precision and a steadiness that she had not 15 years ago believed I was capable of. She knew now. That was enough. I started Loretta on medication the following week. Dr. Hargreaves and I coordinated her care jointly. He managed the blood pressure adjustments and the day-to-day monitoring. I handled the neurology. It was a clean, functional arrangement that worked well in practice and that I suspected he was quietly relieved by, given how long he had been managing her presentations with the knowledge that something was accumulating beneath the surface that was beyond his scope to address. The first follow-up was 6 weeks later. She came to my clinic on a Thursday morning, same time slot, same chair. Grace greeted her by name. Loretta, to her visible surprise, greeted Grace back with the specific warmth she reserved for people she had decided to approve of. I noted that. Filed it away. The clinical picture at 6 weeks was encouraging. The anticonvulsant was working. She had not had a documented episode since week 3. The word-finding difficulties were still present but marginally improved. Enough to be meaningful, not enough to be conclusive. We would need more time. No episodes, I told her. That's significant. She nodded. Sat with it for a moment. It's strange, she said. Not waiting for the next one. That feeling will ease, I said. It takes time to trust the medication. That's normal. She looked at me. Do your other patients feel that way? All of them, I said. Every single one. Something in her face softened. I had learned over the previous 6 weeks to watch for those small softenings. They were Loretta's version of what other people expressed openly, the nearest she came most of the time to letting the interior show. I want to tell you something about what happened over the months that followed. Not dramatically, just honestly. Our relationship changed. Not all at once. Not with a single conversation that resolved everything. That is not how 15 years of distance closes. It doesn't close, not entirely, it narrows slowly through the accumulation of ordinary moments that are different in quality from what came before. He started asking about my patients. Not their names, she understood that was not appropriate, but about the work. What a week had looked like. Whether a difficult case had resolved. What it felt like when something went wrong and there was nothing more to be done. I answered her. Carefully at first, then less so. The questions got better as she understood more. The understanding grew because she was paying attention in a way she hadn't before, and she was paying attention because she had sat in my clinic chair and understood finally, in the most personal possible way, why the work I did was exactly as important as I had always known it to be. She never said I was wrong to throw away the degree. She never said I should have come to graduation. She said it once at the door and that was all. That was Loretta. I had made my peace with that a long time ago. What she did instead, and I want to be precise about this because I think it matters more than an apology would have, was show up. To every appointment. On time, prepared, with her questions written down in the small notebook she had started keeping for exactly that purpose. She took the medication consistently. She followed the lifestyle modifications without complaint. She called the clinic when something concerned her rather than setting it aside and hoping it would resolve. She did the work of being a patient. She trusted me with it completely. For Loretta Stanhope, that was everything. I am telling you this story because I know some of you are sitting with something similar. Maybe it's a parent who dismissed what you were building. Maybe it's someone who made you feel that your ambitions were too large or too far away or too expensive or simply too much. Maybe it's the specific quiet devastation of working for something for years and having the person whose approval you most wanted meet it with silence or worse, with active dismissal. I want to tell you something true. You do not need that approval to build the thing. You do not need the person who doubted you to witness the outcome in order for the outcome to be real. The degree on the wall is not more valuable because someone finally acknowledged it. The practice you built, the skill you developed, the patience you helped, none of that required her validation to exist. It existed because you did the work. What I found in the end was not the reconciliation I had imagined when I was 26 years old standing in that kitchen watching my mother turn back to the stove. That version of resolution, the dramatic, complete, fully verbal acknowledgement of everything, was never going to come. Not from her. Not in the language I had once needed it in. What came instead was something quieter and more durable. A woman in a waiting room, notebook in hand, trusting me with the most frightening thing she had ever faced. A phone call where she asked how my week had been and actually waited for the answer. A Thursday morning appointment where she told Grace she liked the plant in the reception window, and Grace told her it had been there since the practice opened, and Loretta looked at it for a moment and said, she always did have good taste. Not to me. To Grace. Which for Loretta was the loudest possible thing. I'll take it. If you are carrying something heavy today, a dismissal, a silence, a person who couldn't see you clearly enough to understand what you were building, I want you to know this. Keep building. The work is the answer. The work has always been the answer. And sometimes 15 years later, The person who couldn't see it will end up sitting in your waiting room. Let them in. Do the work. That's where the real story is. If this resonated with you, if you've ever had someone underestimate what you were capable of and then had to find a way to keep going anyway, drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. I'll see you in the next one.